Exactly 35 years ago, airlines were changing. At that time, aeroplanes flying long distances were needed. Airbus had not yet designed the A380, and the Boeing 747 was getting old. And McDonnell Douglas was one of the first airlines to recognize this. They had not just an idea, they had a giant, the MD-12. It was like an aeroplane from the future, and it was like the double-decker buses in England. It was much more than an aeroplane. McDonnell Douglas had no reputation and had an opportunity. Could it turn it around? But this giant aeroplane never took to the skies. So why? After years of engineering, marketing, and promotion, why couldn't McDonnell Douglas successfully launch the MD-12 into the sky? McDonnell Douglas unveiled the MD-12 in 1992, and as soon as the aircraft was unveiled, everyone's eyes were on that aircraft. With its huge engines, soaring tail, and full-size double decks, the MD-12 soared through the sky in promotional images resembling a flying city. Not even a concept yet, it was ready to challenge Airbus's future A380 and surpass the Boeing 747 with its 511 passenger capacity. This aircraft was not in the air, it was just a piece of paper, and investors knew it. There was neither a funded production program nor a prototype. McDonnell Douglas had only introduced the aircraft concept. The MD-12 was a desperate aircraft, built by engineers as if it would never be sold. The MD-12 is not just an airplane, it is McDonnell Douglas's last ticket out. The company had been hit by financial difficulties in the 1980s, the end of many programs and the rise of Boeing and Airbus. Military projects brought only modest profits, and the MD-11 fell short of commercial expectations. The MD-12 was considered risky, with everyone saying that the company that built it would go bankrupt. It was a striking design. The MD-12 could carry as many passengers as buses in the UK. It would be the first fully double-decker passenger aircraft in the history of civil aviation. On paper, everything looked ideal, but the reality was different. In the early 1990s, McDonnell Douglas focused on the Asian market to develop the MD-12. Due to its growing economy, Taiwan in particular was seen as a possible partner for production and financing. Another country was needed for MD-12 infrastructure and production, and that is Taiwan. And so the production cost was aimed to be reduced. Taiwan wanted to make an agreement for the construction of this infrastructure. McDonnell Douglas could not provide these guarantees because it had not yet produced the first parts of the aircraft. Moreover, Taiwan's involvement in such a high-risk project turned out to be more of a political liability than a calculated move in a market dominated by Boeing and Airbus. As a result, the transaction failed. This was the biggest mistake of the aircraft's builders. From the beginning, the project was heavily dependent on external financing and co-production agreements. McDonnell Douglas could not have proceeded on its own without them. While the MD-12 was still in the early stages of its development, Boeing was following a much more cautious but calculated path. The 747 series continued to be updated with new models and remained profitable. Boeing had no intention of building a brand new large aircraft because they had the biggest ones. Moreover, airlines already had the well-known, tested, and supported 747. Why would they choose to use the MD-12, an aircraft full of unknowns? Boeing strategically took advantage of McDonnell Douglas's attempt to introduce such a large, costly, and possibly over-specialized aircraft. Boeing promised investors and thus struck them in the heart of investors. Boeing's wide-body airplanes were #1 on the airlines. Then the inevitable happened. Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas in 1997. In addition to its failure as an aircraft, the MD-12 dream also signaled the collapse of an entire company. The MD-12 was a vanity gimmick. The aircraft was actually designed by McDonnell Douglas engineers, and it promises everything to everyone. With 4 massive turbofan engines, a full double-deck fuselage, and a length of 63.7 meters, the MD-12 was a daring display of engineering ambition. It was built to carry 600 passengers, which was close to a record. The ideas for the cabin layout were innovative. Concept drawings included wireless entertainment systems, large lounge areas, and rest areas. However, it took more than bright ideas to turn these engineering promises into reality. Significant funding was required. The double-deck structure required completely new pressurization solutions. The fuselage was expensive to build because of the expensive materials. And this aircraft was very heavy compared to its competitors, so the landing gear had to be unique in the world. Similar problems would arise years later with the A380, but Airbus had the resources and know-how to overcome them. These concepts were only theoretical for the MD-12. Ironically, Airbus would deliver the closest real-world equivalent of the MD-12 years later. The A380 made its maiden flight in 2005, and the aircraft is widely admired and widely used. Before embarking on the project, Airbus analyzed airline requirements, conducted a comprehensive market analysis, and, most importantly, secured billions of euros in funding from European governments. However, in the early 1990s, McDonnell Douglas lacked the financial strength, investor patience, and government support. MD-12 was the last resort for them. The A380 was a strategic expansion for Airbus, risky but compensable. Was the MD-12 designed by McDonnell Douglas before the A380? Exactly. While the MD-12 remained a pipe dream, Airbus brought the A380 to life. MD-12 never flew, and a lot of tests were carried out, but it was not announced to anyone. The reason is unknown, but this huge bird stood out as one of the most talked about non-flying aircraft in aviation history. The primary reason? Those bold first sketches. The huge landing gear, the iconic nose design, the wings protruding to rival the 747, and the huge double-decker cabin depicted in the images. The MD-12 looked like it was in the Stone Age. A few of these drawings were sold to aviation enthusiasts. Aviation collectors are still interested in MD-12 models today. MD-12 mods for simulation platforms are made by amateur designers. Millions of people have watched some YouTube videos showing the MD-12 as if it were a real aircraft. This makes the MD-12 look like a very emotional aircraft. The question, what if, is embodied by the MD-12. It also reminds us that in a field like aviation, where every millimeter is measured, creativity is still important. The MD-12 was McDonnell Douglas's last great endeavor, not just an aviation disappointment. The company had relied on the defense industry to survive the financial crisis of the 1980s. But its market share in commercial aviation had steadily declined. The MD-12 was a last resort due to the safety problems of the DC-10, the lackluster performance of the MD-11, and the poor sales of the MD-90, which was expected to compete with the 757. If this aircraft had been sold a lot, maybe this company could have risen again. However, this was not the case. Boeing bought this aircraft company 28 years ago, and this aircraft is now on the dusty shelves. However, McDonnell Douglas did not leave any gaps. The evolved MD-95 is actually the aircraft we call Boeing 717 today. Douglas's engineering heritage has been used in military aircraft. However, the MD-12 is still the largest but never flown representative of this legacy. Although it has never taken to the skies, it still makes everyone's eyes glaze over. In fact, the aircraft was a turning point for understanding what works and what doesn't work in modern aviation. So what did the MD-12 teach us? 1. The airline industry does not always want bigger. In those years, smaller aircraft with less range were preferred. Only crowded hubs could support a platform as large as the MD-12. However, the hub-and-spoke system was giving way to the point-to-point model. Passengers used to make single flights. Before the MD-12 was even created, this trend marked its demise. 2. Engineering marvels are not enough on their own. The design of the MD-12 was something of a revolution, and everyone was amazed by it. Factors such as financing, guaranteed orders, and market development are equally important for aircraft manufacturers. He announced that the A380 aircraft was a surprise plan for companies, but it is also on the dusty shelves. 3. Perception, communication, and trust matter. The industry's lack of faith in McDonnell Douglas's long-term viability made it difficult for the company to sell the aircraft. Boeing's shadow even exceeded a matter of trust for people. The MD-12 is now only presented to people using it in games or artificial intelligence. Concept models are exhibited in some aviation museums. With the question, where is this aircraft? The MD-12 went viral once again on TikTok and YouTube in the early 2020s. Why is that? Because MD-12 is a potential. It's the aviation equivalent of what if things were different. The A380 is something that makes everyone very sad when the aircraft goes on the dusty shelf. But even though the MD-12 never took to the skies, it has become a legend. There is much more to the story of the MD-12 than just an aircraft. It tells the story of a company's last attempt, a design that eventually turned into a dream, and a vision that misjudged its time. It was an engineering marvel, and the people who built it should be thanked. This aircraft never flew, and everyone thinks it's ridiculous because the aircraft was built, and it's ridiculous that it stayed next to the aircraft for 7 years without ever flying and died there. The MD-12 is a silhouette in technical drawings, a beacon of hope in scale models, and a warning to aviation historians. And this aircraft guided other airlines in the construction of aircraft without flying. Beyond engines, wings, or seating capacity, the aircraft industry relies on invisible but crucial elements such as timing, market analysis, confidence building, and a company's strategic determination. These invisible tests were not passed by the MD-12, but failures are not the only part of the story. The MD-12 looked like it came from the future, so I think that's why they didn't fly it. The dream of a two-story, wide-cabin, 500-plus seat jet only came true years later with the A380, and even then, it only lasted a few decades. The MD-12 would remain in our minds as something that showed the future. It became a representation of what is permanent and what is not, and how fast aviation can change. In a way, the MD-12 asserted its position in the sky without actually being there, because some aircraft are remembered more for the dreams they failed to realize than for the heights they reached. Also, some signs remind you of the road you have not traveled, but do not actually show the road you have traveled. The MD-12 would have gone down in history as the most important aircraft in the history of flight, but it didn't because it couldn't fly. The MD-12 never issued a single boarding pass, did not start its engines, and did not switch on the cabin lights. However, it was more memorable than the aircraft that did fly. It was much more than a McDonnell Douglas aircraft. It was the ultimate what-if in aviation. It was an engineering dream that crumbled against the wall of economic reality. Looking back today, the MD-12's elegance on paper reveals not only a design achievement, but also the importance of timing, strategy, and commercial viability. We can deduce from this aircraft that it is more important than anything else that the world flies. Yet perhaps the most important question is this: would today's aviation map look completely different if the MD-12 had taken to the skies? What are your thoughts? Let's discuss whether this enormous paper aeroplane has a chance to fly by leaving your thoughts in the comments section.